Welcome to Week 1, Unit 5, Egyptian Culture and Art. Here's an image from the Narmer palette, which dates to 3100 BCE. Now, we looked at this image in the unit on the pharaohs as well, because this is a representation of Pharaoh Narmer, one of the first pharaohs of Egypt. And this representation dates from pretty much the dawn of recorded history. 3000 BCE is around the time that Upper and Lower Egypt are united under the pharaohs, and it's also around the time that hieroglyphics are first invented, so you first have some sort of writing system in Egypt to record history. Let's look now at the visual characteristics of the Narmer palette and its representation of Pharaoh Narmer, because we can learn an awful lot from this about Egyptian art. One thing about Egyptian art is that it's very different from art in other periods, or art certainly in the modern world. Nowadays, we tend to think that art is a form of self-expression, and we value artists who experiment and who find their own way of putting a visual stamp on the world and so on. That's not at all what the Egyptians thought. What the Egyptians thought was that there was a certain way that things needed to be represented, and Egyptian art pretty much represents things in this style for 3,000 years or so of Egyptian history, and a lot of this has already been established by the time of the earliest artifacts that we have, like the Narmer palette. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here in the Narmer palette is the size of Pharaoh Narmer. He's much larger than everyone else in this image. He's larger than the man he's about to hit on the head, the man he's conquered. He's larger than the person in the back. And this is clearly not realistic in any way. Pharaoh Narmer presumably was around the same size as everyone else in Egypt, 3100 BCE. And the artist would have recognized this. So why is Pharaoh Narmer so much bigger? Well, that's fairly clear. Pharaoh Narmer is so much bigger because Pharaoh Narmer is more important. So the more important things are, the bigger you draw them. This is logical, but it doesn't fit with the way that our eyes see the world. And one thing we learned from this is the Egyptians weren't interested in recording how their eyes saw the world. They were interested in using art to make sense of the world by giving it symbolic meaning. The pharaoh is the most important, therefore he's the biggest. One thing everybody notices about Egyptian art as you see it is that it's very stylized in the way it represents the human body. For example, we have Pharaoh Narmer here about to smite his enemy, and he's standing in a sort of physically impossible way. We notice that his head, you can see his head is in profile. And then his shoulders are as if we were looking at him from the front of his body, or perhaps the back, but definitely not from the side. Now, the head is from the side, but the shoulders are from the front. The legs as well. We see the side of the leg, we see the side of the foot, even though that doesn't fit with the shoulders where we see the front. Why do the Egyptians do this way? Is it because they saw things like this? Were they visually impaired? No. Again, it follows a sort of visual logic rather than a realistic logic. If you look at a face, what's the most distinctive way to see a face? The answer the Egyptians felt was from the profile. You can tell a face, you can recognize a face much more easily from a profile than from a full face. And we still see this on coins today, where the head of a president or king or someone who's on a coin is almost always shown in profile because they're more recognizable that way. Shoulders, however, are not particularly recognizable from the side. If you show someone's shoulders from the side, you can't really see what their torso looks like, so you show the torso and the shoulders from the front. Feet from the front don't look like much and are kind of hard to draw. Feet from the side, you know exactly what they are, they're feet. And so the feet are always shown from the side, the torso is always shown from the front, the head is always shown in profile. And you can see that this is true not just of Pharaoh Narmer here, but also of the person that he's about to smite. Also, head in profile, torso from the front, feet from the side. Same with the person in the back. One more thing to remark before we move on from the Narmer palette is that in addition to showing people at different sizes, depending on their importance, we also see that the picture space is shared not just by people, but by this very large bird up here in the corner. Now, this bird, again, birds weren't that big in ancient Egypt. What this is a symbolic representation of a hawk that represents an aspect of the pharaoh's power. And one of the things we see here is that symbolic things and real things are being represented in the same picture space. The pharaoh didn't really go around accompanied by an enormous bird, but symbolically the bird shows his power, and so it's represented in that way. Now, this is a beautiful painting from not the time of the Narmer palette, but actually 1,500 years after Pharaoh Narmer, from the New Kingdom in Egypt in around 1350 BCE. And this is a fowling scene, or a scene of hunting birds, from the tomb of Nebaman. Who was Nebaman? Well, we don't know very much about Nebaman, except that he was a middle-ranking official at the pharaoh's court in 1350 BCE, 1500 years after Narmer. And one of the things that's interesting here is that we can see in over 1500 years, the way of representing people hasn't changed very much. We still see that Nebaman, like Narmer, is being shown larger than the other people around him, larger than his wife, larger than the slave girl who's kneeling at the back. He is shown, again, his head in profile, his torso from the front, his feet from the sides. And we see here the enormous power of Egyptian art over a long period of time, in that there has been really very little stylistic change in a 1500-year period. And this is remarkable if we think how much Western art in Europe and the Americas or so on has changed from the year 500 BC, of the year 500 AD until now. Just a remarkable amount of change, as we'll see as the course goes on when we look at art. But the Egyptian art does not change. It's obviously very static, and we get from this the sort of stability and fundamental conservatism of Egyptian culture. Now, again, look at the representation of other things in the picture besides Nebaman. Nebaman is hunting birds, and the birds obviously are shown beautifully drawn and very accurately drawn. You could almost identify what species of bird they were if you looked at them. You also see there's this great scene here of the cat eating the bird, or attacking the birds. Again, that's a realistic detail that a cat would go after birds, but the cat appears to be floating in the air. The birds are way too close together. The birds are much bigger than they would be in real life. There's no attempt at any kind of perspective. Again, we're looking at a symbolic representation that makes sense in terms of symbolism, and what we see here is Nebaman, as represented in his tomb, is dominating the landscape around him. He hunts the birds. He's standing above the fish down here in the water, and we see that, like Pharaoh Narmer, he is making his mark on the world. He is dominating the world. Again, he's like Pharaoh Narmer. He has a stick in his hand, and not all Egyptian pictures show people with sticks in their hands, but there you are. Now, what's interesting about this is that, of course, Nebaman is not the pharaoh. He's just a middle-rank official, and by the year 1350 BCE or so, someone like Nebaman can have himself represented the way that pharaohs were in ancient times, and that shows the ways that the new kingdom is maybe opening up a little bit more than the old kingdom was. Ways of representing the pharaoh are now used to represent anyone who can sort of have the status and wealth to have a tomb made for themselves. Here is another New Kingdom picture. This is a painting of Nefertari, the wife of Ramses II. That's Nefertari, not Nefertiti. And we see here again the profile, this time a picture of a woman rather than a man, but we see the profile presentation and her shoulders presented from the front, her arms presented in profile. Again, everything is represented so that each item can be seen most clearly. Again, she's much larger than other figures. And one of the things we see in this picture is the way that hieroglyphics are used to sort of give information about the picture as a sort of fundamental part of the picture. And this is typical of a lot of Egyptian art. Now, not all Egyptian art, of course, is two-dimensional drawings and paintings. There's also the sort of magnificent statuary of ancient Egypt, and probably one of the most impressive examples is this gold mask of Tutankhamun from Tutankhamun's tomb. Here we see a representation of Tutankhamun as pharaoh. We see that he's got the pharaonic false beard that is a sign of power. He's wearing the crown on his head, which only pharaohs could wear, and the whole thing is made of gold and other precious metals and jewelry and stones and so on. And it's indicative of just sort of the wealth of the pharaohs that you would see this gold statue that is, after all, going to be placed in a tomb, and as far as the people who put it in there were concerned, would never be seen again. Now, did King Tut look like this? The short answer is we don't know, because we're still, even though this is in some ways, a very lifelike statue, it is not necessarily a portrait of Tut. It is rather a sort of representation of the ideal pharaoh, and this is what Tut looks like as the ideal pharaoh. So there's still a certain amount of stylization going on here. The last image we're going to look at is a bust, the famous bust of Nefertiti that is now in the Neues Museum in Berlin. This was, in many ways, a sort of unique artifact. It was created in the reign of Tut's father, Akhenaten, who allowed for a sort of more realistic approach, or a less stylized approach to visual representation. And again, did Nefertiti look like this? We don't know. We don't know what Nefertiti looked like. We know that this is a sort of stunningly beautiful portrait representation of her. Perhaps she was really this beautiful. Perhaps this is how she wanted to be seen. But people who have studied this statue close up and examined it closely have seen that the sculptor has included some wrinkle lines and so on around her neck and around her eyes. They're very subtle. They don't detract from the beauty of the face. In fact, in many ways, they add to it. But they are a sign that this is a statue of a real woman, even if she is Queen of Egypt, as opposed to an idealized picture. And that's interesting because Egyptian art so often gives us the ideal rather than the real. And I think one of the reasons that this bust of Nefertiti is so popular and so acclaimed is that it gives us an image of astonishing beauty that also in some sense is human beauty, and we respond to that.